Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our post-presidential panel presentation of faculty featuring faculty here at Cleveland State University. The 2020 presidential election is over or almost over, depending on your perspective, as an increasing number of people and organizations accept the apparent results that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won the presidential election. The post-election drama is just one unique element of this election. The sequence of events leading up to the election and the election itself stand out in this era of global pandemic, demonstration of justice, the appointment of a new Supreme Court justice, and increased voter turnout, just to name a few. Today, we have the opportunity to hear the views and insights of CSU faculty members about the election writ large, the issues facing our country, and going forward from here. Webinar mode today, which is slightly different from the usual Zoom format. All attendees will be muted, but will have the opportunity to post questions in the Q&A section during the program. Time will be incorporated at the end for panelists to respond. It is now my pleasure to introduce the panelists, as well as to introduce myself. I am Dr. Mittie Davis-Jones, and I am the Interim Director of the Diversity Institute here at Cleveland State University. And I am a retired professor, actually, from the Department of Urban Studies. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. Your view should be the same as mine, so I will start in the upper left-hand corner with Dr. David Stack, who is an assistant college lecturer here at Cleveland State University in the Department of Political Science. He completed his PhD at Stony Brook University, and his research primarily focuses on political donors and congressional voting behavior. He teaches courses on Introduction to American Government, Congress, and Data Analysis. Welcome, Dr. Stack. On the other side, to my right, is Dr. Megan Hatch, who is an associate professor of urban policy and city management in the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs. She has a PhD in public policy and public administration from George Washington University, a master's of public administration from Cornell University, and a BA in government and psychology from Georgetown University. Dr. Hatch's research is driven by a concern with social justice and questions of how state and local public policies are made and their impact on people. It focuses on the causes and consequences of public policies that disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. Welcome, Dr. Hatch. Beneath Dr. Stack is Dr. Ann Galletta, who is professor and chair of the Department of Curriculum and Foundations in the College of Education and Human Services here at Cleveland State. As a social psychologist using participatory action research, case study, and oral history methods, Dr. Galletta works with educators, youth, and community members in studying issues related to and affecting neighborhoods and schools, tracing their history and engaging the public in change efforts. Welcome, Dr. Galletta. To her right is Dr. Ronnie Dunn. Dr. Ronnie Dunn is the Chief Diversity Officer here at Cleveland State University. As Chief Diversity Officer, he serves on the executive leadership team and is responsible for developing policies and practices that enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion within the university and the broader community. Dr. Dunn's research interests include issues affecting minorities and the urban poor, with particular expertise in race, crime, and the criminal justice system, and the use of racial profiling, which led to the use of traffic cameras in the city of Cleveland and municipalities throughout Ohio. And welcome, Dr. Dunn. Now, our last panelist to be introduced is Matthew W. Green, who is an associate professor of law and the Allen Miles Rubin and Judge Willis Rubin professor at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law. Professor Green researches and teaches in the area of employment discrimination with an emphasis on disability law, workplace retaliation, and LGBTQ+ equality. His published work has appeared in the University of Iowa's Journal of Gender and Race and Justice, the University of Kansas Law Review, and the Berkeley Journal of Employment and Labor Law. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Dr. I'm sorry. Well, some people say JD is doctor. Attorney, Professor Green. Okay, so we'll start off with a way of that you might be able to introduce yourselves. And I'd like to ask you to respond to this comment, which is, this election was the most blank for me, in my opinion, or because of. And my idea for this came actually from a young lady who asked me as an elder if this was the most important election in my life, as it has been touted, and I thought about it. And I'm going to just start off by answering the question myself. This would be my only time that I'll answer anything, but this election was the most consequential in my life because in 1968, there was another election, which in my opinion was equally important, and that was the election after the riots in Detroit in 1967. Add up the years, I graduated from high school in 1967, so the riots occurred, tanks were rolling down my street, people were dealing with some of the same issues that we're dealing with now in terms of police, community relations, poor housing, poor schooling, et cetera, et cetera. But what made this election different for me from that period is that I couldn't vote in 1968. In 1968, 18-year-olds were not able to vote. So while we're still dealing with the same issues, this election means more to me because I have the opportunity to express my vote and my voice that way. All right, so we will go in this order and have Dr. Dunn respond to that question. Dr. Dunn, this election was the most what for you and why?
Well, first, let me thank you, Dr. Jones, for convening this panel, and to my august colleagues. It's a pleasure to serve on this critically important dialogue with you. For me, I would say this is the most critically important presidential election, and clearly in my lifetime, and I would go so far as to say in the life of our nation, in that the deep divisions that exist, and you touched on some of those that harken back to the 1960s, but I really, when I look back over the history of our nation, I think we're as divided and polarized now as a nation as we were in that period during the period of the Civil War. I just have great concern and fears for our nation, and hopefully we will be able to heal these cleavages, but it definitely showed how fragmented as a nation we are.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Dr. Galletta, what stands out for you with regard to this election?
Well, in response to the question of what the election meant, I highlight three core themes. These are themes I've observed in conversations I've had with CSU students, faculty, Cleveland area educators, educational policy folks, LGBTQ+ advocates, and immigration advocates. And there are likely themes that I've not addressed, but the three that I would speak to are repudiate and repair, stand vigilant, and realize what can be. A time to repudiate the legacy of the last 4 years and repair an already fragile system reflecting unresolved legal and social ambivalence toward human dignity, civil rights, equity, and access to that which provides health, well-being, and political representation. Vigilance, in the sense of how campaign platforms are precariously positioned against a Senate that has already enabled much harm, and the realities of the culture of white heteropatriarchy that thrives in electoral politics. And lastly, realizing what can be in the activism of youth and young adults, the press for mattering of Black lives, the demands to address the detrimental human effect on our planet, the outrage over reversals in asylum policies and separation and detaining of families, and the legal and social removal of the right of an individual to identify and express their gender.
Thank you. Very thorough. I appreciate that. Professor Green, would you care to respond to that, please?
Sure, yeah. So I agree with everything really that's been said before, and particularly our need to correct course with respect to things like climate change and LGBTQ plus rights and the issue of asylum seekers. And I agree with Dr. Dunn wholeheartedly about the division. And even if we don't go back as far as the Civil War, certainly the second Reconstruction during the 1960s, I mean, we are, I was a baby then, but we are extremely divided. But if I answered this question, I would start it this way. The election for me was the most unsettling, in my opinion, because of the uncertainty of the outcome. I think what occurred in 2016 was absolutely shocking. I wasn't expecting President Trump to become president, to win the election because of the polls. And I think a lot of other people probably felt the same way, but here we were. And it concerned me a great deal that he could be president because he'd never run for public office. Some people thought that was a feature, something to praise. I did not, because I think public service means something. Certainly politicians can stay in office too long, and I think it becomes nothing but raw, naked power, sort of a power grab. And I think we're seeing that, and that's not even referring to President Trump. I just think we're seeing that. But I really didn't think that someone who never aspired to be a public servant, to be a servant of the people, should be president. I think you have to be able to put others above yourself, and I didn't think we saw that in Donald Trump until he succeeded, and I don't think we see it now. I look at what's happening now with the refusal to concede, which could have serious national security implications and hamper the incoming administration's ability to deal with the coronavirus. And we may not even be able to appreciate all of the implications of this delay. Not to mention the racism, right? That someone came to power claiming that the first African-American president was not born in the United States, the whole birtherism issue. He mocked people with disabilities, right? One of my areas of research. He encouraged violence at his rallies. He politicized the Justice Department, taking it on as his own private law firm. And the defamation case that was filed against him, which is still ongoing, the Justice Department actually tried to take that over and said he was acting in his capacity as a president when he said, no, I didn't defame a woman who accused me of rape from the 1990s. He's asked a foreign government to investigate his political rivals. I could go on, right? Shortly after he came to office, he settled a fraud lawsuit for $25 million. This is who we elected. So I was concerned also about the reshaping of the federal judiciary. So considering all that and more, I don't think this country could have withstood another 4 years. But I don't think anyone looking at the president couldn't appreciate that he's a talented man, right? He knows how to market himself. He knows how to stir up a crowd. I saw this blitz in the waning days of the campaign from state to state with the huge rallies and crowds. And it's the same thing I saw in 2016. So I thought, well, he indeed may win again. But he did not. And I think our institutions will be the stronger for it. I respect the views of others. I know not everyone shares all those opinions I just gave, but the question was what it means to me. And so that's what I shared.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Hatch, can you respond to that statement?
Thank you. I agree with my co-panelists on the implications of this election. I took this question a little bit differently, and I'm glad. I was worried I wouldn't have anything to say, being second to last. But for me, this election was the most illustrative of the need for good election policies, because we directly saw the implications of our policy choices before the election happened. So we can think of that in sort of three main buckets. The first being registration practices and how much that varies state to state, whether, in Ohio, we had to register by, what was it, October 5th or something like that. Other states, you could go in that day and register. And so that has a big implication for who can vote and when you can decide you want to vote and things like that, which I think is really important as a country to think about. The second one, we saw a lot about mail-in ballots, and those rules became really important. When you could apply for them, where you could drop them off. We had the concerns about the postal service that came in all at the time, so we saw a lot of implications there. And then with that, states varied a lot on when they could open and start validating those. And that led to, Ohio, we were able to get our results pretty quickly, but we're still working through some of these states, and it took many days because in places like Pennsylvania, where they couldn't even open those ballots until after the polls closed, that made a big difference on when we could get results. And then the third thing related to results is thinking about when we release results. We saw states that did it sort of piecemeal, Pennsylvania was at first Trump, and then 4 or 5 days later, we could finally say Biden. And so that led to a lot of uncertainty. I imagine I'm not the only one who didn't really sleep for 4 days because I didn't want to turn off the news and find out that the election had been called. And so thinking about moving forward, whether states want to release all their election results at once or if they should wait, all these choices about how we run an election has a huge impact on how the public feels about those elections and how the public's able to participate in elections.
Okay. Very interesting insights. I appreciate that. Thank you. And Dr. Stack, your thoughts on what was most significant in this election for you?
I would say in many regards, I would say the election was very concerning, particularly what has been happening after the election. So the level at which there's an attempt to undermine political trust and an attempt to undermine the legitimacy of elections is very concerning. And I think another aspect of this election that really struck out to me was the nationalization of the election. So in general, presidential elections are, focused on national politics. One thing we've been noticing, or one thing that seems to be happening with congressional elections, is congressional candidates are increasingly unable to sort of run on local issues, and instead are evaluated based on their partisanship. So this may be sort of undermining incentives to vote against undermine incentives for bipartisanship in Congress. And what we've been observing in Wayne County with the ballot certification disputes, I think a lot of local elections may now become nationalized. I think in this case, institutions have done a relatively good job of holding up, but I'm not sure if I'm as optimistic as Dr. Green is regarding the endurance of the political institutions. So our formal institutions like Congress and the Senate and individual elected offices have held in this election. But parties are another very important political institution, and they are responsible for selecting individuals to sit on these county boards that certify ballots. And if there's a movement within particularly the Republican Party to sort of show to select individuals that are willing to ignore popular election results when making these decisions about elections and about sort of these more technical matters, it might be tougher for other institutions to endure. So I'm somewhat less optimistic for the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you all for the insights and perspectives that you brought to that question. All very informative. So the issue of polls was actually mentioned in at least one of your responses. So the polls before the election predicted a blue wave in terms of who was going to win the presidency and who were going to win the congressional seats. Why were the polls so inaccurate? What do you think they revealed or did not reveal about the election and or polling? Dr. Stack.
So this election definitely undermined some faith in polling. Overall, the polls, or at least the state level polls, overstated Biden's support by about 5 percentage points. So this is a pretty big miss, and it's been a consistent miss. So they missed in 2016, not by quite as much, but they still missed. And there's a few reasons they could be wrong. One reason you might hear the pundits say the polls are wrong is shy Trump voters. Overall, I don't think the evidence really supports this explanation. The biggest misses tended to be in states where Trump was very popular. So the shy Trump voter argument is basically Trump voters may have been uncomfortable expressing their support for Trump when pollsters called them. And given the sort of Trump parades and the enthusiasm of Trump supporters, I don't think this necessarily holds. And I don't necessarily, I think the biggest miss was in West Virginia, where President Trump has a lot of support. And I don't necessarily see there being a lot of social pressure in West Virginia to indicate support against President Trump. Whereas the polling in more Democratic states tended to be a bit more on point. Another reason polls could be wrong is the turnout models were wrong. So when they're trying to project, when these polling organizations are trying to project vote shares, they need to sort of make a guess as to what the electorate is going to look like. And President Trump tended to do very well with white voters who didn't go to college. And historically, this group tends to have lower levels of political participation. So if he got this group to vote and then pollsters underestimated how effective President Trump was in mobilizing this group, that could be one reason the polling would be off. And this would be a somewhat more optimistic take in that public opinion polling is probably performing pretty well on other issues. So we can still trust it to gauge how the public feels about issues. From a research standpoint, the most concerning aspect would be if there's a bias in who's answering the polls. So one of the themes of President Trump's presidency is working to undermine trust in institutions and the legitimacy of institutions. So one of the institutions he has spent a lot of time attacking is the polling industry and the idea that polls can be trusted. So if these attacks resonated with his supporters and they became less likely to answer polls, then a lot of our public opinion polling on other issues may be incorrect. So and in particular, there's pollings that look at the legitimacy of the election. Mm-hmm. And I believe about 70% of Republicans right now indicate that they don't think the results of the election are illegitimate. But that may be understating the severity of the case if the really distrustful Trump voters are not answering the polls. So it may be a bit worse for political trust than we realize. Mm-hmm. Another reason, hopefully it might be a one-year thing, but another explanation for this potential bias in how people answer polls could be COVID. So I believe Democrats and Biden supporters were more likely to wear masks and more likely to follow stay-at-home orders. So they may have just been easier for pollsters to contact. And if that's the case, it might be a one election sort of thing where COVID really messed up turnout models, messed up who answered the polls, and it won't be an issue in the future. But there's a lot to think about when we evaluate the validity of these polls now. And it'll take a bit of time to answer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Dr. Dunn, would you like to weigh in on that question? You're gonna have to unmute.
Yes.
Here we go.
Actually, I think Dr. Stack gave a very comprehensive and thorough response to that question. My initial thoughts around it was obvious. The pollsters aren't able to accurately capture the essence or the sentiments of the Trump supporters in particular. Now, my thoughts initially go back to what Dr. Stack described as the shy Trump voter. Given the racial, salience in this election, the prominence of race, I thought that some of this might be due to the reluctance of people to explicitly express their racial views or to pollsters, and then that not accurately reflect what's captured in these polls, and people just voting the way they feel comfortable once they get in the ballot booth, but not expressing that. And given the distrust and the discounting of science in particular, I could also see where ardent Trump supporters might intentionally try to bias the data, just given their distrust and distaste for science. So, but once again, I think Dr. Stack touched on many of the, potential causes for this difficulty that pollsters seem to have. They've clearly undermined the integrity to election cycles here. So we'll only have to see what long-term effect that has, and if they're able to course correct and get it right or closer next election cycle.
Exactly. Thank you. So as noted to some extent already, we did have record turnout as far as voting in this election. It was anticipated to be very high in Ohio, with 3.4 million vote by mail ballots cast, which in the United States, the voter turnout was the highest, as projected to be the highest that it's been in 100 years, at 66.7%. So how would you react to the record voter turnout in Ohio and the United States? And given the turnout of voters, was this the greatest expression of democracy ever, or in recent times, or is it evidence of something else instead, or in addition to being the greatest expression of democracy? Dr. Galletta, would you like to respond to that?
Well, a couple of things just to reiterate, that our turnout in Ohio was 5.8 million people casting ballots, and that is significant. In 2008, with Barack Obama, 5.77 million voted, but we did exceed that at this time in Ohio. The breakdown speaks to what other panelists have already noted. The 8% difference in the votes, with Trump at 53.1%, Biden at 45.2%. What is interesting is the Ohio youth turnout. 53% of voters age 18 to 29 turned out, which is 10% higher in Ohio than the 2016. So something was going on, particularly among young people. And young voters backed Biden nationally, particularly young voters of color. I think the enthusiasm about the vice presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, was very important to many young voters. I think her background as a woman of Jamaican and Indian descent. Her use of a Twitter feed that included her pronouns, her recognition of many of the issues that young people are bringing to the table. I think that was very significant. And I think that there's also an awareness coming out of this election of the pervasiveness of misinformation and information that often could be harmful. So particularly in thinking about voter turnout and in thinking about what this implies, a number of educators have talked to me about the importance of media literacy and critical reading of what sources individuals come across, what evidence is provided to back up those sources, and how they compare to other sources. So I think the turnout reflected the tensions and the fracturing that my co-panelists have mentioned in terms of a real cultural divide. It also reflected just a huge amount of enthusiasm for the vote, for the franchise, for both members, for both parties.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Stack, would you like to weigh in on that question?
Yep, sure. So overall, I think there's a number of reasons we've seen record-setting turnout. I think Dr. Galletta did a great job of hitting all the points I was going to touch on.
Okay.
So I'll try to keep my answer a bit short, but one thing that really impressed me about turnout was overall the youth turnout. So it was about 53% for this election versus 48% for 2016. So young Americans are really recognizing how important politics is and starting to get involved, which I think that's particularly important because voting is a habit and a learned behavior. So if young people are voting now, they're significantly more likely to vote in the future. So it will have important downstream effects for future elections. Another potential reason we saw this surge in turnout was, could be a changing electoral map. So if you're in a state where it's where it's not a swing state, voting for president doesn't matter as much. So if you're in California, if you're in Wyoming, you're gonna, it's pretty clear who that state's gonna go to, and that can disincentivize voters from voting. One state that had the most impressive surge in turnout was Texas. So Texas hit their 2016 voting totals before election day. So I think as states become swing states, if Texas does become a swing state, that will help turn out throughout the nation or turn out through future elections as well. That's also probably a pretty good argument for instituting a national vote system as well. So that would probably help with engagement overall.
Right. So speaking of swing states, Ohio had been a swing state. I don't know, may have lost its standing in that regard. But according to the election results, Trump won by 8.1% or 8.1 points in Ohio in 2016 and was leading by the same number in 2020 with about 93% counted a couple of days ago. So, and if we look at, what happened with regard to congressional seats in Ohio, Republicans won 12 of 16 seats and Democrats won 4. What do these results tell us about the state of Ohio? Is this still a swing state? Or what can it tell us about our political orientation here? Matt Green, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. So in terms of us being a swing state, I mean, I'm still relatively new to Ohio, and I think Governor Strickland was still in office, and that turned around, and I don't think we've had a Democratic governor since. But I think what we're seeing at the congressional level is a product of gerrymandering. drawing these congressional districts in a way that it's almost impossible. It is impossible for someone of another party to win or prevail. I followed somewhat tangentially the race with Jim Jordan, and that was because of the controversy with respect to the wrestling. Some of the players saying that they had told him that they had been victims of sexual assault, et cetera. And I was wondering whether that would have any effect on his reelection, and it doesn't. And I think that just goes back to the phenomena we're seeing, not just here in Ohio, but in a lot of places. Gerrymandering, and the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, decided a case a couple of years ago where it said that federal courts really have no role in trying to remedy partisan gerrymandering. So really, it's up to the states if they're going to do it, and some have implemented redistricting committees that handle that, and in some instances, the Supreme Court of the states have stepped in, happened in Pennsylvania. But I think it's not great for democracy, right? I think it takes away a lot of the voice of people who are in those districts, but whose perspective really are not being represented. And I also think that it leads to the most extreme voices in those areas having the most power, the most authority, because there's no incentive to try to come to the middle and find common ground at all. I mean, you're more incentivized just to go as far right as you can, because that's really where the base is, and you're able to do it. And clearly you can probably get away with, I think, almost anything. And I know it happens on both sides, but it seems to me that the Republicans recently have been able to weaponize gerrymandering in a way that far outpaces what I think Democrats have been able to do. So that's what I think part of this is. A lot of this is in Ohio and elsewhere. It's part of gerrymandering.
Okay, good point. And I think the commission that was set up is supposed to kind of weigh in after the census count to maybe come up with another approach to dividing up the districts.
Yeah, and I guess that the big thing that I'm reading about that is it's supposed to give more of a voice to the minority party. And so, we'll see how that works out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dr. Stack, would you like to add a comment or two on that question?
I agree with Dr. Green's point about gerrymandering being a major issue. It's going to be, I believe Republicans held on to a number of state houses and state legislators. So overall, after the redistricting process, they most likely will be able to redraw the districts to solidify the gains they've made in this last election, as well as make life a lot more difficult for a number of Democratic representatives. So it's bad now. It will probably be a bit worse after this next after 2022. So Democrats are in a very rough position for the 2022 election. Broadly for the Electoral College, I believe did you mention the Electoral College in the question as well?
That's coming up, but you can go ahead.
Nope. Okay. Nope. That was the next question. So I think Democrats in Ohio are going to be in rough shape. I believe Ohio is projected to lose a seat. Given the composition of the state legislature here, that will most likely be a Democratic seat. So there will be more, it will be a bit more lopsided after this redistricting.
Wow. Okay. All right, so touching on the Electoral College. So this election, the popular vote and the electoral vote are consistent. The Electoral College is following the popular vote in terms of the outcomes of the election. President Biden won both. President-elect Biden won both. So how might this affect calls to abolish the Electoral College? President Biden, last data I saw, had 290 electoral votes, or 51% of the popular vote. And President Trump had 232 electoral votes, or about 43% of the popular vote. So how will this affect, or do you think it'll affect calls to abolish the Electoral College? Dr. Hatch, your thoughts on that?
Sure. These calls to abolish the Electoral College have been around for a while, and we can think of the Hillary winning and Gore winning, but this has been around for a while. And as my co-panelists have talked about, that the way that we do presidential elections and the way that we redistrict really does disenfranchise some voters. I can say personally, being through my early adult life a Massachusetts voter, I wasn't ever really concerned about who was going to win Massachusetts. It's been a foregone conclusion for a very long time. And so that is quite disenfranchising. However, I'm pessimistic that this is going to change. And I'm pessimistic because once people have power, they don't want to lose it. And the Electoral College gives power to some of those states that have very small populations. Mm-hmm. The Wyomings of the world and Nebraskas, and although Nebraska's doing some interesting things, some of those states, they don't want, if we went to a popular vote, every rational in the economic term presidential candidate's going to go spend all their time in California and some of these other really large states, and they're not going to go to the Iowas and the Wyomings and the things like that. So those states that have smaller populations aren't going to want to give up that power. So I see the struggle to actually change anything being unlikely, or to take states and populations going against their own best interests and going against power. So I think that this probably doesn't change anything, because this tension between power and popular vote has always been there and will continue to be there.
Okay. Your thoughts, Dr. Stack?
I agree with Dr. Hatch's point that particular states may not be overly on board with changing the Electoral College. It does, once a party wins it, it does sort of entrench. They have an interest in keeping it around. I think I am slightly a bit more optimistic as to whether attitudes on it might change. So I know going into before the 2000 election, sort of the conventional wisdom going into the election was that the Electoral College benefited Democrats, and that Bush was likely to win the popular vote, and Gore was likely to win the or more likely to win the Electoral College. And it turns out the opposite happened. Going into 2016 until the night of the election, I think there was a lot of Republican opposition to the Electoral College, and there was a belief that Hillary Clinton might lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College, and that belief sort of shifted overnight. So I think if there's a case where it's unclear whether the Electoral College is benefiting Democrats or Republicans, it might be possible for them to forge agreement. So if Texas becomes a swing state, it would then become the locus of national politics, and maybe the rest of the country won't be too on board with allowing Texas to call direct the direction of the nation. So if it's uncertain who the Electoral College will benefit, and it overrepresents a big state like Texas, then there might be support for changing it. But I think that's a big if, and overall unlikely. Mm-hmm. So I think it's unlikely, but I have a slightly more hope than Dr. Hatch. Not much though.
Okay, well, difference of opinion is healthy, that's for sure. So I'm going to turn to the local arena. So while the turnout was high nationally and in the state, turnout was low in the city of Cleveland. What do you think contributed to the low turnout in the city of Cleveland, and what can be done about it? Dr. Dunn, what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, I think that the turnout in the city was due to a number of factors. One, the coronavirus pandemic precluded the ability to do traditional turnout the vote campaign efforts. The fact that Joe Biden, the vice president, and his ticket, for the beginning of the campaign, they primarily held virtual events. So that doesn't tend to mobilize or energize the base, if you will. So I think that kind of diminished some of the turnout. And also, I don't know to what degree the ticket actually excited the base here locally. You know, there's a lot to unpack there, particularly when you consider some of the increases that President Trump had among African American voters, Black males in particular. That was very surprising to me, or disconcerting, let me say. I actually did some voter registration work in 2016 and was taken aback by the number of young African American males that said they were going to vote for Trump. And it was primarily due to their sexism. They wouldn't vote for a woman candidate. So, you know, the increases that Trump experienced in the Black male voting population, I wonder whether that's as a result of the sexism and the misogyny that exists, that he seems to symbolize and for a certain segment. As we know, he's been, there were charges against him for rape and different types of sexual abuse and aggression against women, which he pretty much just he dismissed, and with the whole Me Too movement, he kind of you know rebuked that, if you will. So I just think that there's something there that a certain segment of the Black male population might have been attracted to, along with the materialism, when we consider like the number of rappers that came out in support of Trump. I think there's something there that needs to be unpacked as well. So.
Okay, interesting. Dr. Stack, would you like to weigh in on that question? How can we increase voter turnout or responses to the low voter turnout in the city?
I think efforts to increase registration might be helpful. I think in some regards, the Biden campaign didn't seem to be too focused on Ohio. So when it came to their advertising strategy, Trump had more, I believe, in most of Ohio. In Columbus, Trump had about a 3-to-1 ad advantage. Most of Biden's ads seem to be concentrated towards the Toledo market, and I think that may have been more oriented towards Michigan, or the Toledo media market. So that may have been more oriented towards Michigan as opposed to Ohio. So I think investment in Ohio, in order to win, they would need to invest in advertising, as well as invest in sort of developing the institutions that register voters and try to increase turnout. I think they existed, but I think COVID made a lot of sort of door-to-door registration drives difficult. So I don't know how much of 2016 was COVID related, how much was related to sort of a trend in Ohio.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to turn a little bit to the U.S. Congress and the current state of affairs. So as of November 17th, Republicans had gained 9 seats in the House of Representatives. How might this affect the presidential platform going forward, especially since, if history holds, the midterm election in 2020 is usually a bad one for the incumbent's party? So as of recent times, the Republicans were up by 8 in Congress, in the House of Representatives specifically, and the Democrats were down 7 there were still 12 races to be called. But either way, the Democrats will still have a majority, however slight. What do you think that forebodes for the current state of affairs in Congress, Dr. Stack?
I think it. I think it does not bode well for Democrats in Congress. Again, I think they'll lose some seats just due to lack of control over the redistricting process. I also tend to think that there's sort of a midterm slump. So the president's party historically doesn't perform well in midterm elections. So since it's so close, the Democrats' ability to withstand a midterm slump isn't there. So I could, right now, I would say Republicans have the advantage going into the 2016 election, or not the 2016 election, the 2022 midterm elections. When it comes to voting in Congress, Republicans are likely to try to magnify the divisions in the Democratic caucus. So I don't expect them to extend sort of the hand of bipartisanship too much. They'll try to make Democrats vote in favor of all the bills. They won't try to make it easier for marginal Democrats to reach across the aisle and say that they're engaging with Republicans. Democrats are sort of anticipating this, and they're rewriting some of the rules of the House to make it easier for their members in marginal districts to vote against Democratic policies without actually endangering the Democratic agenda. So a lot of what happened in this last Congress was Republicans would spring motions to recommit on Democrats that were trying to pass bills. And after these motions and this is basically the minority party's only opportunity to amend bills. What Democrats are looking to do is change the threshold for a motion to recommit to pass from a majority vote to a 2/3 vote. And what this will do is allow Democratic members like Spanberger, who's in a bit of a more conservative district, to vote in favor of the motion to recommit, vote in favor of Republican policy, while not actually being meaningful or not endangering the Democratic agenda.
Thank you. So a question came in through the Q&A regarding ballot boxes or absence of ballot boxes throughout the state of Ohio in different counties. I think each county was only able to have one drop off, although I guess in Cuyahoga County there was another one across the street from the other. So Dr. Dunn, do you think the lack of places where people could drop off their ballots might have had an effect on the voter turnout?
Yes, I do, particularly in the context of the pandemic. So once again, I think that likely did have an impact in suppressing the vote. And if we saw the images at the Board of Election, we saw those long lines of people there just to go in and vote. So then you add to that the congestion trying to drop off your ballots at one ballot box within now the second largest county in the state is just unfathomable. So once again, another method of suppressing the vote basically is what we saw in Cuyahoga County, being the Democratic stronghold in the state. So we know what the obvious impact or intended potential impact would be there.
Thank you. So turning back to the Senate, which there's still 2 elections, I guess, to be determined in Georgia in terms of the Senate. Speaking of nationalizing elections, that seems like it's going to be a poster child for nationalizing two senatorial races in one state. But at any rate, what are the implications of Senate control for future judicial appointments? You know, a lot of judicial appointments were made under President Trump, and apparently a lot of positions were not filled under President Obama. So Professor Green, what are your thoughts about that?
So that's a really good question. Let's see, I have that in 4 years, President Trump has nominated about 227 judges, and 8 President Obama nominated about 329. And so President Trump has really changed the face of the judiciary. I think that the Democrats thought they would have a great chance taking over the Senate in places like North Carolina, Montana, Iowa. That did not pan out. And so now everything does hang on these 2 runoffs in Georgia. You know, I with respect to the judiciary, I think that the Senate really did hamstring President Obama in getting judges confirmed. I don't know whether, even assuming that the Republicans are going to the Senate, I don't know whether President-elect Biden will have that dynamic. Maybe he will. He does, I think, have a relationship, perhaps with Senator McConnell and some of the others that maybe President Obama did not. I think there was an incentive to hamstring President Obama in a lot of things, and I think judges being one. But nevertheless, I mean, I think, you know, judges that's one of the most enduring legacies that any president can leave. And it really concerns me, if it would really concern me, and it does concern me, the ability of President-elect Biden to get his judges confirmed, because particularly with what I do, employment discrimination, civil rights, I mean, those laws are very broadly worded, you know, but a lot of the teeth that they have comes from the courts, you know, and I've seen repeatedly how a very narrow interpretation of some of these civil rights laws can just take all of the force out of them. I mean, I'll go, you know, cite numerous examples, but I'll just one, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in 1990. And the Supreme Court got a hold of it, and literally to have a qualifying disability was, you know, like finding some gold, you know, hidden. I mean, it was just very, very difficult to come by. There were cases where people who filed claims under the ADA actually died before their cases finished the system, and the ultimate conclusion was, well, you weren't disabled enough to really have a claim. I mean, I saw that, and so this is, to me, this is you know, what's at stake with respect to these judges being confirmed. I think anyone who has a commitment or who values civil rights and I think that those statutes should be broadly interpreted to protect the most vulnerable and marginalized among us. Look at this, and I think they should be somewhat concerned with respect to how the Senate unfolds, whether the Democrats are able to take these 2 seats, and even if they aren't, whether the Senate will have somewhat of a different relationship with President-elect Biden and his nominating and confirming judges than they did in the past. I'm not that optimistic about this, but we'll see, because, you know, everyone knows the importance of the judiciary, and this isn't a new battle, right? I mean, I think this is from the Warren years back in the 1960s with civil rights and race issues, and it's like the Republicans have just recognized the importance of the courts, and we have had a conservative, I think, majority on the court now for a number of years, and it's just even gotten more so with the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying, and being replaced by Amy Coney Barrett. So those are my general thoughts.
Okay. Very insightful. Thank you. So the Senate will also be responsible for approving cabinet appointments. And some of you are involved in researching and advocating for specific policy areas. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are regarding the Senate's role in approving appointments for certain positions, especially or specifically education, housing, and Department of Justice. Dr. Galletta, would you like to respond to that question? Some of the concerns or issues regarding who's going to replace Betsy DeVos, among others.
Yeah. So in that respect, you know, we see some of the tensions between who the choices might be. So we have Linda Darling Hammond, who already has already declined as president. You know, she's already president of the California State Education Board, and yet is playing a big role in planning with the Biden transition team. And we see a number of superintendents for large urban districts being looked at, which, you know, reflect different platforms of school reform strategies. We see teacher union leadership, you know, the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, and the National Education Association, Lily Exelson Garcia, also in consideration, as well as a number of other individuals who have been awarded Teacher of the Year or have some other accolade that speaks to the Biden transition team. I think with the Senate at the K-12 area, you're going to see this play out ideologically. You know, the particular mechanisms that senators believe are associated with improving, you know, districts and schools can be very different. You know, with some folks really asserting what's been present since Clinton onward, right through to Betsy DeVos's and under the Trump administration in terms of support for vouchers and charters as a way to get at improving school districts and increasing student achievement. So, you know, that's going to be a point of tension that will definitely play into the decision making. Other issues around school discipline, the Department of Education working with the Department of Justice under the Obama administration, providing guidance to school districts around proper strategies for school discipline that may involve restoration programs or reconciliation programs with students. Those were reversed in the Trump administration, and school discipline has been approached very differently, returning to many of the punitive strategies, which disproportionately affect Black students, poor students, students with disability, and students whose first language is not English. You also will see things play out around equity and inclusion. You know, we saw in the Trump administration, again, the reversal of the inclusive policies towards transgender students and the right to use a bathroom associated with the gender identity that they had. So these are areas where who these nominees are, these ideological differences will play out. It's interesting, the teachers' unions have been very, very active in the last number of years and have really pushed an agenda for, you know, smaller classroom sizes, availability of counselors, social workers, librarians, and school nurses. And so that activism and those demands for professional wages are likely to play out as well. And then at the higher education level, there will be tensions around the regulation of for-profit colleges and universities, around student debt, and also around policies regarding sexual harassment on campus.
Wow, there are a lot of issues there and a lot of places where ideological perspectives could definitely come into play. Thank you for sharing that. So Dr. Hatch, I know that health and housing are two areas that you have researched and have some expertise in delving out into the policy of. Could you share your thoughts about like the appointments and how who's nominated and who's approved might play out in Senate?
Absolutely. So before thinking about housing specifically, I have some comments on the process. In just about all my answers as I was preparing for this panel, I kept saying, Georgia, Georgia, Georgia. It's going to make a difference. It's going to make a big difference what happens in Georgia. Is there going to be a split Senate? Is it going to be 51-49? Is it going to be 52-48? That's going to affect who can be nominated and who will be confirmed. If we get a 50-50 split, then Vice President Harris becomes the deciding vote, and that can make a difference. But because it's so split, we're probably not going to see for any position a really extreme one way or the other, because they still need to make sure that they can keep their votes. So I think we'll get slightly more moderate in that way. But the split also affects who can be nominated. So in a lot, the day after the election was called, seeing like the Politico speculation and some of the other ones that have come out, there are a lot of senators on that list for all the positions. But if there's a senator, they have to give up their seat. And the way that happens in states varies a lot. And so the Biden administration is going to have to be very strategic about that. So using my home state of Massachusetts as an example, there's good reasons to believe Senator Liz Warren could be a cabinet member in probably several different departments. But what would happen in Massachusetts is that there will be a special election, but in the meantime, the governor of Massachusetts gets to appoint a senator to replace Senator Warren. Well, the governor of Massachusetts is a Republican. So if we're already in this very tenuous balance, and then you have a couple states that you replace a Democratic senator with a Republican appointee for some amount of time, that then shifts the balance of the Senate. So there's going to have to be a lot of very careful thinking about that. And that might affect who can be a cabinet member, at least in the short term, especially. In terms of HUD, I actually don't think that actually, I'm hesitant to say this because I think my crystal ball has officially broken in 2020. But if I was to predict, I don't think HUD is going to be a senator. But kind of piggybacking on what Dr. Galletta said, whoever the nominee is going to reflect priorities. And in terms of housing, we're in the middle of a massive eviction crisis, which is only going to get worse if the CDC moratorium expires and if nothing's done to help with that. We have concerns about mortgages and foreclosures, affordability. Housing isn't necessarily affordable in a Cleveland, and it's sure not affordable in a New York City or a San Francisco. So we have all these issues. So who Biden decides to nominate is really going to set their priorities. So some of the names that I've seen, and I have a personal preference, but that's me. But someone like Diane Yentl from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, that's signaling that if Biden was to nominate her, that we're really focusing on affordability and vulnerable homeowners and renters. But if someone like Atlanta's Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms is chosen, that's a reflection, at least partially, of thinking Atlanta and thinking Georgia, but that's going to be a different type of HUD than if it was someone from a nonprofit or someone with a research background. So I'm very curious to see what happens. And we can do that, not just in HUD, but in every single department. It's really a reflection of what the administration thinks is important and where they're going to spend their efforts in the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Along that line, what do you think about the issue of fair housing and what happened just not too long ago with the repeal of the affirmatively furthering fair housing policy?
Yeah, as I have told my students and others probably on Twitter, I think a lot of the first bit of the Biden administration is going to be returning to Obama era policies. And I do a lot of advocacy work on fair housing. So from my advocacy brain and even, some of my research, I hope that the affirmatively furthering fair housing is one of the first things that's returned, and really focusing again on fair housing, on keeping governments accountable. Same thing with the Community Reinvestment Act, like making sure that we're holding banks accountable and making sure that mortgages are held accountable and how we do mortgages. So I think all of those, I suspect that'll be one of Biden's priorities. And from a fair housing perspective, that's really imperative that we get the affirmatively furthering fair housing back pretty quickly. And once again, depending on who the HUD director is, you'll see that happen faster or slower.
Okay, thank you. So during the campaign, President Biden's record or role in the passage of the 1994 crime bill came up with the consequences having negatively affected African-American people. I didn't hear too much said about the First Step Act to reduce recidivism that was passed under President Trump, but what do you see coming up, Dr. Dunn, as far as criminal justice reform, given Biden's kind of the stain on his record and what Trump has been able to say he's done for African American people and others as relates to criminal justice?
Yes, well, I appreciate Professor Green's facial reaction to first of all, I think one thing, we might see more bipartisan support in this arena around criminal justice reform, in that we have seen that on both sides of the aisle over the past 5 years or so, more support for criminal justice reform. Now, as far as the First Step Act and the efforts of the Trump administration, I found it interesting whenever President Trump speaks of issues affecting Black America, that's what he always points to, how many African Americans he's pardoned. So that for him symbolizes the whole of Black America, it seems. As far as criminal justice reform, I really think that as Megan pointed out, given the balance of the Senate, the appointments are going to have to be more moderate, but I think they might have more latitude on this appointment, given that there is more likely to be bipartisan support. A couple of names that I've heard floated out there would be Sally Yates, or I'm thinking Tom Perez, who was on the DOJ and the Civil Rights Department or wing of the DOJ when they actually implemented the consent decree here in Cleveland, and then went on. He's currently the Labor Secretary, I believe, but was the chair of the DNC for a while. Those are two names I've heard put out there. One that, I think should merit some serious consideration is Keith Ellison, the Attorney General in Minnesota. As we know, he's prosecuting the George Floyd murder case with, the police officers there. So, given the historic racial justice movement that we've seen evolve in the wake of George Floyd's murder, I think this will be one of the more critical appointments that we see made. There'll be a lot more attention on this, and you pointed to President-elect Biden's record relative to the 1994 crime bill and the disproportionate adverse impact it had in the African American community. Well, we know his vice president, like Kamala Harris, also faced significant scrutiny early on the campaign trail, given her track record and as Attorney General of the state of California. So I'm, optimistic. I guess I should qualify that and say cautiously optimistic. We will finally see some real substantive criminal justice reform at the federal level. We know that there are some bills that have been introduced, the George Floyd Act, which talk about establishing national standards in policing, a national database to track officer misconduct and those that have been decertified, as well as banning the chokehold. I think racial profiling legislation is a part of that, and just so I'm optimistic that we'll get a strong appointment to the DOJ as Professor Green indicated. The current administration has utilized the Justice Department as their personal law firm. So I'm sure we'll see a return to the independence of the DOJ. And once again, I'm optimistic that we will also see the use of the consent decree, the DOJ investigations of corrupt police departments, again, to help local jurisdictions deal with their issues at the local level. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Green, any thoughts about appointments in terms of Dr. Dunn did mention Department of Justice, but any others that come to mind for you in terms of how the weight of how the Senate is likely to be constructed or possibly constructed, how that will impact?
I agree. I think with Dr. Dunn and Megan, Dr. Hatch, about probably a more moderate candidate would be more palatable. A name that I've heard is Doug Jones, who was a senator from Alabama, and who didn't win his election, that he might be a candidate to head the DOJ. Yeah, and I agree with everyone else also about the DOJ's record, or not strong record on civil rights recently. I know in some of the cases that I've covered or followed over the recent years, the bar DOJ has been just opposed to civil rights. There was a recent decision just this past summer where the Supreme Court surprisingly interpreted federal law to protect LGBTQ individuals in employment, right? The Boster v. Clayton County case. Well, the DOJ filed briefs in several courts against that position, right? The Supreme Court, bucked it, but that's what we're dealing with. So I'll stop there.
Okay. To expand a little bit on that, what would you like to maybe see going forward, Professor Green, as far as anti-discrimination protection legislatively at all levels, possibly?
So certainly, I think that, I do employment discrimination, and I think the laws are there. I do think I go back to the interpretation of them, right? So this just goes back to my earlier discussion about the courts, and I think it's just going to be so important that President-elect Biden's judicial nominees are confirmed, and we get a little more balance on the courts. I mean, the judiciary again has, I think, been remade. It's again the lasting legacy of any president, and holding Merrick Garland's nomination up, and President Trump having 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, and numerous appointments to the courts of appeals and district courts. It's going to have a long-term effect. So I'd just like to see a little bit of, I'd like to see more of President-elect Biden's nominees being confirmed, and hopefully that will have an effect on the interpretation of these civil rights laws going forward.
Okay. So it was mentioned that young people have increased their voter engagement through voting during this past election. What effect might the Black Lives Matter movement have had on that increased participation and other protests to end institutional racism? Dr. Dunn, what do you think?
I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, and once again, the racial and social justice civil rights movement that we saw evolve over the summer, had a significant impact on the election. I think that, and I clearly was hardened by that, the activism of the young people, that's critical, that's important to be out there and you know, agitate, but they have to translate that into the political arena, which it appears they did in this instance. So I was very pleased to see that. That shows that level of maturity. And you think about it, even going back to, and with the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement, which actually stemmed from the Trayvon Martin case in 2013, but we really saw the emergence of it in the wake of the Michael Brown killing in 2014. Many of those grassroots activists have now moved into the political arena and elected political officials. And actually one member was elected to Congress recently that started there, I think in Ferguson, if I'm not mistaken. I can't recall her name offhand. So I think it has had a significant impact, and I think it's going to continue to for some time. And you know, I also don't want to lose sight of the activism of the young people in the wake of the Parkland shooting as well. So we've seen a number of incidents, these fatal and critical incidents, and the response of the Gen Zers and the millennials to that have brought us to this national reckoning, racial reckoning that we're now witnessing. So I was on a panel the other night, and Dean Fisher's law class on racial justice and equity. And I shared that, and I've told my students this. I haven't been in the classroom now for 2 years, but you know, over the past 5, I had shared with them that they give me optimism for the future, and truthfully, to think that we might potentially see, if not the eradication, but the diminishing significantly of racism in our country in my lifetime. That alone gives me great hope, and I'm very heartened by that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Galletta, were you able to comment on that question of the various social movements and their role in the current political arena?
I think that at a time of great frustration, uncertainty, gloom, worry each day, anxiety about what will come down via Twitter and implications for groups that have been marginalized. I think that the political activism has really generated a consciousness. You know, I think as a faculty member at the university, we really looked inward, personally and institutionally, after the brutal death of George Floyd and the Breonna Taylor, the killing of Breonna Taylor, and just one after another, and these not being new, they just were compounded in this past year. And so I think that there's a power in the deepening, of understanding politically what needs to happen and what needs to happen, institutionally. So I would say that that's had great effect. And the other thing is that these are movements that are really being generated from the ground up. And they are really being activated without the direction of individuals who typically hold a great deal of power. And so that I think that spontaneity, the creativity, the artwork that's been employed, the beautiful murals that have occurred across the country and across the world, I think that's a level of political involvement that we desperately need, and that really is going to come from the young people.
Okay, thank you. Well, those are both very encouraging comments, and I'm on board with hoping that they come to fruition. So this will be the last question. It's kind of going almost back to the beginning. And this is a question regarding the Supreme Court. So I find this to be very interesting because there is some talk about stacking the Supreme Court. So as you know, just before the election, President Trump appointed Amy Coney Barrett as a justice to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And since that time, the notion of increasing the number of justices has been floated. To our two experts on this subject, Professor Green and Dr. Stack, what are your thoughts about that? Professor Green, do you think that's likely to happen? That there is likely to be a move to quote unquote stack the courts?
I think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely because President-elect Biden said he's not in favor of it. He did say that he would like to convene a commission to study, reshaping the courts and the process of appointing judges, et cetera. But he had no, it didn't seem like he had any stomach for stacking the court or adding additional members. And it seems to me that would take legislation, that would take a move from Congress anyway. He wouldn't be able to do that unilaterally. So I don't know if there'd be a lot of will for that, but I mean, I do think something should be done. And I kind of like his idea of a commission. I guess we'll have to see how it plays out. Bipartisan commission, I guess we'll see how it plays out. But with the power grabs that are going on, I think it's going to be an uphill battle to change the courts because they're just so important. But those are my thoughts.
Okay. And Dr. Sack. Oh, yes.
I largely agree with Professor Green there. I think it's pretty unlikely. If Republicans win in Georgia, there's no way it happens. If Democrats win, then they would need to convince Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema to be on board with it, and I don't necessarily see them being supportive of it. Only scenario where I see it happening is if the Supreme Court had a very aggressive decision that aggravated both Sinema and Manchin. So I don't think we'll see a packed Supreme Court, at least for a while.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. So we are now at 1:30 exactly, and this has been such an informative panel presentation. Your answers have been very insightful, instructive to me. I have learned a lot, and I see, as we have observed, that there's movement at all levels, from the grassroots to the Supreme Court and all places in between, in terms of what is happening politically and will continue to. So I hope that the people who joined us today have benefited from spending this time with us. There were a few questions. I think we answered all of them. There was one that was directed to you, Dr. Stack. I don't know if you're able to open the Q&A. Maybe you could respond to that person. Yeah, if you could respond to that person.
Can you elaborate comments regarding redistricting in Ohio? Do you think the features of the redistricting program will produce any improvement? I'm somewhat skeptical. I believe it's set up so that that if the state legislator can't agree with the majority of both parties, that it goes to a redistricting commission. Republican I believe Republicans would have a 5-2 advantage on the redistricting commission. So that would be a point where gerrymandering and partisan drawing of districts could enter in. If the redistricting commission doesn't approve it, it eventually goes back to the state legislature for a normal partisan vote. I think there's some provisions that require a certain number of counties to not be split by the drawing of districts. I'm not sure how much of an effect that would have on the ability to draw aggressively gerrymander. So it might help a bit, but I don't see it being a huge factor.
All right, well, that's kind of discouraging probably to some of us who push
Sorry.
those those signatures and petitions to get that set up. But, you know, politics is incremental, right? So maybe we'll move.
I think it might help a bit. I'm probably a bit too cynical sometimes.
But that's okay. Let's need that balance. Okay, so unless anyone has any final words, I think we will close here, and thank you all so very much. I have really enjoyed spending the time with you, hearing your responses, and getting to know everybody just a little bit better. Okay, I hope the rest of the semester goes well. You have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, all.
Jones.
Bye, thank you.
You.
Well, thank you.